Welcome to our program. I'm Bob Barrett at Crozet, Virginia. I've studied the life and accomplishments of Claudius Crozet for 30 years, and I'm still learning. When you're involved with Crozet, you're led to the Virginia Military Institute at Lexington, Virginia, as he was a principal founder and the first president of the Board of Visitors for 5 years. After VMI, you're led to Newmarket, Virginia, to see the Battlefield Park, where the VMI cadets fought and died on May 15, 1864. Crozet served as a soldier, an educator, a civil engineer, and a builder for 60 years. As we work our way through this documentary, you will see a number of accomplishments this man, who some called a genius, was involved with, including the railroad tunnel through the Blue Ridge Mountains at Afton, Virginia. It was by far the longest tunnel in the world at the time. He had a great impact on transportation and education. Thank you for watching.
Claudius Crozet was born into rebellion and revolution in Ville-de-France in the department of Rhône, 20 miles northwest of Lyons, France. His hometown was founded in the year 1212. His father was Francis Crozet, a wine merchant, and his mother was Pierrette Varian Crozet. He had a sister Eliza and a brother William. Another brother, Benoit, died a year before Claude's birth. This Catholic cathedral was there when he was born, and may be where his family worshiped. Claude's mother died when he was 10 years old. Crozet entered the École Impériale Polytechnique on November 22, 1805. This school trained civil and military engineers. Napoleon had organized it under military discipline. Students were on duty from 5 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week. Studies included geometry, chemistry, physics, architecture, mines, mechanics, and drawing, and much more. Quite a load for a 15-year-old. The school was blessed with outstanding and famous teachers, such as Captain Malus, who in 1807 discovered polarization of light, and the great mathematician and senator Gaspar Monge, who developed descriptive geometry.
At the end of his studies at the École Polytechnique in 1807, Crozet selected the artillery branch and was appointed to Napoleon's general staff just before the Battle of Wagram. He was attached to a battalion of bridge builders that formed a part of the artillery train of the Imperial Guard. It was as a specialist in bridges that Crozet followed the Grande Armée into Russia in 1812. As an officer, he developed technical ability, a military eye, and the ability to make rapid decisions.
Napoleon looked invincible. He was a master strategist who had amassed the greatest army ever. He took 650,000 troops into Russia, but the Tsar would not back down. Crozet was a captain of artillery in Marshal Ney's division of some 40,000 men. On June 12, 1812, the French crossed the Niemen River and the invasion of Russia began. Napoleon wanted a quick victory, which did not happen. The Russians recognized the superior French forces, well-trained and ready to fight. They retreated, burning everything the French might use: crops, buildings, and livestock. The French army had marched 1,200 miles and could not resupply itself. They didn't have winter clothing. Men were getting sick and many deserted. They were very hungry. The winter hurt the French. The Russian plan was working. Napoleon's health was bad. He did not commit his experienced Imperial Guard. He probably had the idea they were the last to protect his monarchy. When the French marched into Moscow, it was ablaze, having been set afire by the Russians. 6,000 buildings were destroyed. Napoleon's soldiers sacked the city as the Russians continued to retreat. The muddy roads and the harsh Russian winter took their toll. Out of Marshal Ney's division of 40,000, only 400 got out. Tradition has it that Crozet was captured by a Russian nobleman and spent the next 2 years at his home. This capture occurred at one of the fiercest battles ever, Borodino. The Medal of the Legion of Honor was pinned on Crozet by Napoleon. It was one of France's highest decorations. Captain Crozet was released in April 1814, left Russia and went to Metz, France, and on to Paris and stayed at his father's home. Later, returning to the army in 1815, he was ordered to take powder and other artillery supplies to Napoleon, whose army was at a place called Waterloo. Days of heavy rain clogged the roads with mud, and he could not arrive on time. The battle took place on June 18, 1815. Years later, Crozet would tell the story, suggesting that if the roads had been open, Waterloo might have been much different.
Having lived a life of adventures and exploits with the Grande Armée, the fall of the emperor must have seemed to him like the end of an epoch. This young man of strong character could not find a place for himself in the restricted world of the Restoration.
The year 1816 was to be a great milestone in Crozet's life. In April, he decided to leave the army, and he was discharged April 16th. On June 7th in Paris, he married Mademoiselle Agatha de Camp. Crozet was 26 and his bride was 33. He identified himself as a wholesale merchant. His bride's parents were deceased. Together, the couple had 24,000 francs to enter their marriage, and the government owed Captain Crozet 2 years of back pay for his military service. He never received that after years of petitions. However, they would be considered in post-war France well off financially. Crozet was tired of war and all its problems, and he decided to seek a new life in America. He would never see France again. Other events in 1816 which would play a part in his new life were the building of an arsenal at Lexington, Virginia, passage by the New York legislature for the building of the Erie Canal, regular steamboat navigation started on the Mississippi River, the rejuvenation of the Military Academy at West Point, the establishment of the Second Bank of the United States, and Virginia establishing a Board of Public Works. A fellow passenger on the sailing ship to the United States was General Simon Bernard, a French engineer and fellow École Polytechnique alumnus. He was Napoleon's aide-de-camp from 1805 on and was said to be last officer with him at Waterloo. Bernard had met Captain Thayer and Colonel William McRee in 1816 when they were in France to secure information on equipment and books and fortifications. These officers convinced Bernard to move to the United States, and Bernard would become Brigadier General of Engineers and be assigned to inspect the fortifications at New York and Fortress Monroe, Virginia. He was also appointed to the Board of Visitors of the U.S. Military Academy and would plan the first defense of the Atlantic seaboard. General Bernard probably recommended Crozet for employment at West Point. Crozet also carried a letter from the Marquis de Lafayette, who was a friend of Mrs. Crozet's family, and also recommendations from Baron Rochemont and General Laracy. Crozet was employed as assistant engineering professor on September 20th, 1816 by Brigadier General Joseph G. Swift. 4 of the professors, there were 7, were French. Crozet would be known as the first teacher of descriptive geometry in the United States. He used a French textbook. He was elevated to department head on March 6, 1817. At the time, West Point was the only engineering school in the United States. J.H.B. Latrobe, a cadet at West Point from 1818 until 1821, left his description of Crozet.
Crozet was a tall, somewhat heavily built man of dark complexion, black hair and eyebrows, deep-set eyes, remarkable for their keen and bright expression, a firm mouth and square chin, a rapid speech, and a strong French accent.
On August 3, 1817, Adelaide Eugenia was born to the Crozets. In a letter to General Swift, he asked for a salary increase and suggested the professor of engineering should be at the pay level of the other professors. Crozet was unhappy with the location of West Point, its cold climate and distance from any city. After 2 years, he wanted to leave. He didn't feel the professors were properly treated. It would be 5 more years before he would resign. Crozet sent what amounted to a resume to Thomas Jefferson in March of 1821. It was simply addressed to Thomas Jefferson, Esquire, Monticello, Virginia. He told of his attendance at École Polytechnic Institute, his 10 years in the artillery, his 5 years as professor at West Point. He spoke of change which the last Congress imposed, which could hurt West Point. Crozet explained that he could take charge of instruction in math, philosophy, military science, and civil and military architecture. As a P.S., he apologized for writing in French, saying he had not yet attained perfection in English. Jefferson's reply on March 31, 1821, explained that they were far from the time of procuring professors, with 2 to 3 years left to finish the buildings. Also, there was a heavy debt, and it was uncertain when classes would start. Crozet's training and experience helped him make a great contribution to the curriculum at West Point. He taught cadets to build bridges, canals, buildings, roads, and fortifications with the best professional standards. A report from the U.S. Military Academy Board of Visitors in 1822 stated,
Captain Crozet is by far the best mathematician in the United States.
In 1821, Crozet wrote a book on descriptive geometry for the cadets at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, New York. It was used for many years. The Crozet family was blessed with a son, Alfred St. Armand, born about October of 1821. He would be destined for the military. A daughter, Claudia Natalia, was probably born in 1823. Her name suggests a Russian origin. In 1823, Virginia needed a new principal engineer to supervise road and canal construction. Crozet was 33 when he applied for the position and won over about 20 others. Crozet was chosen on April 9, 1823. He resigned from West Point April 26, 1823. Virginia was the largest state east of the Mississippi River from the Atlantic Ocean to the Ohio River, including West Virginia. Captain Crozet arrived in Richmond June 1, 1823. His orders would be to look at the feasibility of improving certain streams for navigation, laying out certain highways, and determining which turnpikes between fixed points were the best. President James Madison in 1816 had championed the Board of Public Works for Virginia. In the early 1800s, Virginia was not in a good economic position. Young people were leaving to seek employment. Transportation was not at all well developed. There was not a good system or organization. The roads, canals, and rivers did not connect well. East-west movement of people and commerce was very limited. The beautiful Blue Ridge Mountains were like a giant fortress saying, "You can't pass through me." In 1825, his most important work was to survey for the James River and Kanawha Canal. The job kept Crozet away from home from March through November. Anthony Rucker of Virginia is credited with the invention of the James River bateau, also called the tobacco boat and the market boat. Described as 30 to 50 feet in length, it had platforms fore and aft so it could be steered from either end. Also, a hogshead could be rolled on from either end. The beam was hogshead height, and the barrels were scotched or chocked with blocks of wood to keep them from moving. Each gunwale had a walkboard for the men to use the paddles in quiet, deeper water, or iron-tipped poles in rough or shallow. They traveled downstream in groups of 3. If the return trip involved rough water, 2 of the bateaux could be sold for lumber, with combined crew working the boat and freight upstream. Rucker waited until around 1821, when he was 80 years old, to start patent proceedings. The bateau had been around so long and in such universal use that many people scoffed at the idea that he had invented it. But none other than Thomas Jefferson stepped forward in a letter to the editor to claim the invention for Mr. Rucker, saying that he had been a spectator at the launch of the first boat of that kind on the James River. Unfortunately, Anthony Rucker died before the patent office granted the patent. His heirs received it instead. The vessels were abandoned in the early 1800s with the advent of larger canal boats able to carry more goods. In 1983, a construction crew discovered the remains of 60 boats in Richmond, giving modern Virginians their first look at how a bateau was built. There is an annual bateau festival on the James River. These scenes were recorded in June 1994. The Crozet family purchased this house in Richmond and lived here from 1824 until 1832. They would own several other properties in Richmond. The home is located at 100 East Main Street and has been a law office for some time. The house was built in 1814 by Curtis Carter and included 2 brick outbuildings, a smokehouse, a carriage house, and stable. It is the oldest of the surviving houses in the area. Miss Mary Wingfield Scott mentions the house in her book, Old Richmond Neighborhoods, as being remarkable for its brickwork, doors and mantels, built-in bookcases, rich trim, and wainscot. The house has been altered over the years. It is interesting to note that even though the house was rented over 100 years, the woodwork was practically uninjured. In Richmond on March 8, 1830, at the age of 12 years and 7 months, Adelaide Eugenie Crozet died. A sad blow for Crozet, Agatha, Alfred Armand, and Claudia Natalie. In Colonel Cooper's 1936 biography of Crozet, he referred to a letter discovered in a secret drawer of Crozet's desk. He had written to Adelaide the year before, encouraging her in reading, writing, drawing, and gardening.
Do not forget to keep some seeds of the best vegetables. It is not too late to sow a little crop of peas. Your mama says your health is better. This is the most agreeable news I could receive. Take care of it. Be very prudent. Do not presume on your strength. An accident might throw you back a good deal yet.
In 1832, Crozet found what he thought was a great opportunity. Louisiana needed a chief civil engineer. There was a railroad under construction. Many people spoke French. The legislature voted a salary of $5,000. Governor Andre Roman became a friend of Crozet's. Later, there was a marriage between their families. The Crozet family traveled from Portsmouth, Virginia, down around Florida, up the Gulf, and then up the Mississippi. The state exported cotton and sugar and tobacco using the Mississippi River to move their produce. Governor Roman, when he introduced Crozet to the legislature, said, "He's ready to execute any survey you might want." Crozet was immediately swamped. They needed roads built. There was better navigation needed on the rivers and bayous. They needed a railroad constructed. All of this amounted to an impossible load for many engineers. Crozet pushed for a railroad from New Orleans to Washington. He resigned in 1834, became president of Jefferson College at Convent, Louisiana, and a year and a half later resigned and worked as engineer for the city of New Orleans, where the Crozets had their home. In 1837, Crozet was serious about returning to France. But Governor David Campbell of Virginia asked him to return to his old job as chief engineer. Virginia was now more progressive, and Crozet was very happy. He said that Virginia had the best harbor in the nation and believed that the state could realize the dream of east-west trade if they acted soon. Crozet is quoted as saying, "Senator Joseph Carrington Cabell of Nelson County was a lion in his path." Cabell was the president of the James River Kanawha Canal, and Crozet saw railroads as the way of the future. Cabell had been instrumental in dropping the chief engineer's job on Crozet's last term. One of the problems with the engineer's jobs was a responsibility without authority.
When Crozet returned from Louisiana in 1837, he became interested in a movement to convert the state arsenal at Lexington, Virginia, into a military college. The idea was to replace the state guards with another group of young men, aged 17 to 24, to do their duties without pay, but in return they would receive a liberal education. Governor Campbell appointed Crozet to the Board of Visitors. His experience at the École Polytechnique and service as an artillery officer with Napoleon, his experience as engineering head at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, and service as president of Jefferson College made him an excellent candidate for the VMI board. Crozet was twice elected president of the Board of Visitors. After a good deal of time and problem solving and much preparation, VMI would be born. Crozet was 47 and remained president over 5 years until June 30th, 1845. On June 8, 1839, the board appointed Francis H. Smith of Hampton-Sydney College as principal professor and superintendent. He first met the board on November 11th. Smith would hold that position for 50 years. He was 26 years old when he was selected. Superintendent Smith was a West Point graduate. William Forbes of Richmond was the first cadet to matriculate. For a short time, VMI would have a reciprocal agreement with Washington College, exchanging classes. Crozet, Francis Smith, and Major John Thomas Lewis Preston have since then been considered the founders of the Virginia Military Institute. Preston was professor of modern languages and a citizen of Lexington and was considered the original champion of the project. The regulations suggested by Crozet were almost identical to the West Point regulations, and they reflect the École Polytechnique as well. Practically no detail was left out of the regulations. Here, for example, is the dining menu for the cadets.
Breakfast, hot corn cakes and fresh light bread, butter, coffee, and cold meat. Dinner, 2 varieties of meat, 2 kinds of vegetables, cold light bread or cornbread. Supper, same as breakfast, exchanging coffee for tea or milk occasionally. Plain dessert once a week. When a cadet is sick, he shall have such fare as the surgeon shall prescribe and receive proper and necessary attention from the steward.
Surveying for the proposed railroad from Gordonsville to Stanton in the summer of 1838, Crozet went to Simmons Gap and decided that the terrain was too difficult. In the summer of 1839, he and W.D. Thompson surveyed Rockfish Gap at Afton, south of Simmons Gap, and determined that was the most favorable route. 10 years would elapse before his suggestions would materialize. In July of 1842, Crozet was in Lexington attending the Board of Visitors meeting and the first graduation exercises at the Virginia Military Institute. In December 1842, Crozet summarized a list of detailed reports related to his second term as principal engineer. An examination of the Upper Appomattox River to Farmville, Lexington and Covington Turnpike, Giles, Fayette, and Kanawha Turnpike, that was 134 miles, Price's Turnpike and Cumberland Gap Road, Wellsburg and Washington, Pennsylvania Turnpike, Natural Bridge Turnpike, the Cumberland Road, the Ohio River and Maryland Turnpike, the Valley Turnpike, that was Stanton to Winchester, now Highway 11, the Stanton and James River Turnpike, the James River Canal, the Lynchburg and Salem Turnpike, the Northwestern Turnpike from Winchester by way of Clarksburg and westward, Richmond and Fredericksburg and Potomac Railroad, Richmond and Petersburg Railroad, Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. It is easy to see this was not a 9-to-5 or a 40-hour-a-week job. By the end of Crozet's second tour in 1843, no network of railroads were there to tie the state together. Joseph Reed Anderson was superintending engineer of the Valley Turnpike. He was out of the West Point class of 1836. He had 1,000 men at work and was in full compliance with Crozet's recommendations. In August 1840, 70 miles of the 92 miles were finished. The Virginia General Assembly in March 1843 decided the office of principal engineer was no longer needed. In 1845, Crozet began a new position as the principal of the Richmond Academy. When Crozet took over in 1845, the school buildings were in disrepair because the school had very little money. Crozet was generous and put some of his own money into the school and also secured $1,000 from the city council. It was at the southeast corner of Marshall and 10th Street. Crozet taught classes in engineering, construction, and architecture.
He had a way of distilling in those things which he associated a homely solidity that ensured thoroughness, respect, and permanence,
said an unnamed contemporary of Crozet. To show their appreciation, his students presented him with a silver loving cup engraved with his name in 1847. The cup is in the Valentine Museum. One of Crozet's students, E.T.D. Myers, would become an engineer on the Greenwood Tunnel project in the 1850s. A Richmond Academy student described Crozet.
In person, Crozet was large and well-proportioned. He had a military bearing, and by his appearance indicated his early training. His head was singularly large and helmet-shaped, and his eyes, of a deep blue, were wonderfully bright and intelligent. As a teacher, he was patient, forbearing to a fault, and wonderfully lucid. He was fond of youth and loved to talk to them. He had read so much and seen so much that to hear him converse was a rare pleasure.
Imagine, if you will, how a pioneer in the instruction of engineering in a young nation might influence progress and the economy as his students became engineers and teachers. In England in 1769, James Watt harnessed the power of steam. What followed changed man's concept of how to move a boat, and among other innovations, how to move cars on a railroad. Up until then, there were some railroad trains pulled by horses or mules. Crozet later heard about steam engines and railroads in Europe. He began to recommend them for Virginia. The advantages included flexibility compared to canals or river transportation, which can freeze and were limited to places where there were sources with water. They could later be used at all times of day and night. They could conceivably haul larger loads at a lower cost. History tells about a railroad fever, an evolution of equipment, road beds, connections, and expansions. In 1837, the first sleeper cars were used. In 1840, there were almost 3,000 miles of track in the USA. In 1994, rails were being abandoned at the rate of 2,000 miles a year. In March of 1849, the legislature passed an act providing for construction by a state corporation to be known as the Blue Ridge Railroad Company. 17 difficult, expensive miles from Mitchum's River to Waynesboro at the west end of the mountains. No more than $100,000 would be spent in any fiscal year of the entire project, and expected completion was in 3 years. Crozet applied to be chief engineer for this Blue Ridge Railroad. In 2 days, he was notified that he had the position at a salary of $3,000 plus all the necessary expenses except lodging and board, which Crozet felt was a very reasonable compensation. The main tunnel to Waynesboro was about 3 miles from that portal, and down to Mitchum's River was about 13 miles. Crozet described the 8 miles from the east portal to Blair Park as very complicated and rugged. At Robertson's Hollow, he suggested a short tunnel that he referred to as the third tunnel. After the Civil War, it would be called Little Rock. 2 miles down from Little Rock would be an 800-foot-long tunnel called the Brooksville Tunnel, which would prove to be a very difficult work. Then east of that was the Dove Spring Hollow, requiring deep cuts. The line continues a steep, broken, and rocky hillside until it comes to a long spur at the location of the Greenwood Tunnel, which would be about 500 feet long. Then to Blair Park, the ground improved on down through the area called Kelly's Cut. The specifications for the Blue Ridge Railroad are in the Congressional Library. They consist of 15 pages signed by Claudius Crozet. Mitchum's River was a village in Albemarle County. The Reverend Edgar Wood, in his history of the county, states the name came from George Mitchum, who was granted land along both its banks. It is located at the confluence of Mitchum's River and Licking Hole Creek, so called because wild animals licked minerals along its banks. After the railroad arrived in 1852, a depot was built high above the streams. There was a lot for livestock, a wagon scale, a general store, a post office, a public ice house, a blacksmith shop, a bark mill, and later a cooper's shop and a cannery, and also a barrel factory. 5 roads crossed here, including 3 notched from Richmond to Stanton, the Brooksville Turnpike, a planked road from Rockfish Gap through Batesville to Israel's Gap, Broad Axe Road, and Brown's Gap Turnpike. In 1790, William Jarman built a flour mill of 4 stories, which was destroyed by fire April 10, 1951. Price's Hotel at Mitchum's River, built around 1840 as a residence for Captain Oldham, became a popular vacation resort. Today it is a private home. Brooksville was originally a stagecoach inn on the Stanton and James River Turnpike. It is located at the eastern foot of Afton Mountain. Crozet made his headquarters here for 8 years while building the Blue Ridge Railroad. It was an original land grant to Richard Stockton in 1744 with 2,000 acres. A town was here called New York or Little York. General Phil Sheridan reportedly destroyed the town except the main building and the post office during his raids in the Civil War. The original postmaster was William Stewartson, reported to be nominated by Thomas Jefferson. The home was remodeled by Mr. and Miss Cole Sandridge Sr. in the late 1940s. It is now a private estate. The first tunnel from Mitchum's River west was at beautiful Greenwood, Virginia. The finished length would be 538 feet. The contractor was John Kelly. The cost was $74,000, and it was arched with bricks, and it was a dangerous job, requiring heavy timbering. This is the west portal during World War I in 1917, with soldiers on guard for sabotage. In 1944, the tunnel was bypassed with this cut just adjacent to it. This is what is left of the Greenwood Tunnel, now sealed over. Its appearance 145 years later says it must have been a magnificent structure. This is the more recent depot, which was torn down some time ago. Charles Witt Sr. was station agent from the mid-1940s, retiring in the 1960s.
This is what's left of the old Greenwood Tunnel. It looks like it was a magnificent structure. Up on top, we see that square area where they took the thing called the plinth off there, which was the piece that had the names of the contractors and Crozet's name and the resident engineer and so forth on the job. One of those is down at the Virginia Military Institute in front of the Crozet Hall.
The Brooksville Tunnel was more dangerous than Greenwood. There were 2 interior slides. The contents of rocky ground, Crozet estimated at 50,000 cubic yards. It kept the engineer worried about the possibility of an accident. 700 feet of the tunnel was a mixture of soapstone and stiff clay, the cohesion of which is destroyed by air, Crozet reported. He praised the contractor, John Kelly. Some workers wanted to quit, but Mr. Kelly convinced them to stay. There were financial difficulties associated with this tunnel. Also, it required a 3-foot arch. The final cost was $114,000 at $131.90 per foot. It was 896 feet long, and Brooksville was completed in October of 1856. The problems were actually staggering. Henry S. Drinker described it at length in his classic study on railroad tunneling. Brooksville Tunnel was condemned, and in 1928 a new tunnel was completed to replace it. The J3 Greenbrier engine number 600 blast out of the west portal of the second Brooksville Tunnel, train number 93, in July of 1948. It is a 484 type. At 100 feet long and built on a curve, Little Rock Tunnel was the shortest of the 4. Crozet referred to it as the 3rd tunnel, or the short tunnel. It is the only one of the 4 still in use in 1996, and most of its length has been topped out. Its original cost was $12,390, and the contractors were Gallagher and McElroy. Crozet was happy with his engineering staff, but getting along with the contractors was another issue.
When Crozet was building the railroad through the mountains, a sad event occurred. Crozet's son, Alfred St. Armand, was destined for the military. He entered the United States Military Academy in July of 1838, graduated in 1843, and entered the Army as a brevet second lieutenant. In 1848, he was promoted to first lieutenant. There were 39 in his class. He had a classmate named Ulysses Simpson Grant, who became president. Another classmate, Thomas J. Jackson, who took a position at the Virginia Military Institute as professor of natural philosophy, tactics, and artillery, and later was known as Stonewall, the famous Confederate general. Young Crozet served throughout the Mexican War. In 1845, he took part in the military occupation of Texas. Later, with the 8th Infantry, he took part in the battles of Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma. The next 2 years, he was on recruiting duty at Jefferson Barracks, Missouri, and Austin, Texas. He was married. On April 23, 1855, at Cincinnati, Ohio, while on sick leave, Alfred St. Armand died. His body was taken to Richmond, Virginia, and buried beside his sister, Adele.
Once construction was started, pressure existed to build temporary tracks over the top of the mountain to give some service to the people of the Great Shenandoah Valley. This was undertaken and required a lot of old-fashioned hard work and engineering. These tracks could also serve to move construction materials. The temporary tracks overlooked the valley from Afton at the old Afton Hotel. The temporary tracks were completed to Stanton April 1st, 1854.
Je peux gagner sur cette montagne. I can conquer that mountain.
Crozet seems to be known for one subject more than any other, the Blue Ridge Tunnel. They located the exact line of the tunnel in summer of 1849. The main tunnel would be 4/5 of a mile long. It would be 700 feet below the apex of the mountain, meaning that shafts were not possible for ventilation. There would be a single track tunnel 16 feet wide and 20 feet high. The shape was elliptical. This 1917 photo taken by James P. Nelson shows the east portal of this remarkable project. This is the west portal with soldiers on guard. The tunnel was dug at Rockfish Gap. The mountain material was composed of greenstone, granite, and quartz. The final length of the main tunnel was 4,273 feet. The tunnel was 1,496 feet above sea level and had a grade from the east at 70 feet per mile, making the west end 56 feet higher, among the steepest in the world. It would eventually have a brick arch of 700 feet length from the west. The tunnel was worked from each end at the same time and had a 3-degree curve throughout its length. It was the longest tunnel in the world at the time, with no contenders even close. To further show the genius of the man, when the two ends met in the middle, it was only a few inches off center. To further amaze people of the 20th century, the tunnel was constructed before dynamite was developed and also before there were pneumatic drills or earth-moving equipment. They did have black powder. From the west portal to Waynesboro was about 3 miles. From the east portal to Mitchum's River was about 13 miles. The final cost of the Blue Ridge Tunnel was $488,000, which is $114 per foot. Criticism throughout the project was epidemic. Newspapers, cities without rail service, individuals saying it could not be done. There was widespread betting on what the outcome might be. On Christmas Day, 1856, the two ends hold through. Crozet went to great lengths to accurately report to the Governor and General Assembly on the progress and the problems. The tunnel has been called one of the greatest engineering marvels of the 19th century. The American Society of Civil Engineers in 1975 would designate the Blue Ridge Tunnel as a National Civil Engineering Historical Landmark. Other such designations are the Roosevelt Dam, the Mormon Tabernacle, and the Erie Canal. The Civil Engineering Society of Virginia gives an annual Crozet Award for outstanding service. There were many problems in building the tunnels, including cave-ins, slides, water, and air quality from black powder blasts and dust. Also, there were accidents and illness, including the cholera epidemic in 1854. There were state economic problems, construction costs, cost overruns, late schedule overruns. There were strikes and other labor unrest. The pay for workers, many of whom were Irish, was 75 cents per day and later went up to over $1 a day. They worked 3 8-hour shifts around the clock. The average progress was 26.5 feet per month, and oak ties were used.
Crozet was very resourceful, and he was often called upon for problem solving. One big example was smoke and dust from the black powder blasting in the tunnel. He and William Krause fashioned a Burgoyne ventilator which consisted of an inverted tub moving up and down in another tub with water. This was traversed by pipe through which air is alternately introduced and ejected. It was powered by mules on a treadmill, and the smoking problem was resolved forever. Another example, at the west heading of the main tunnel, mechanical pumps were sufficient for water removal until they struck a large spring. Crozet brought in 1,800 feet of 3-inch pipe, and he succeeded in siphoning 2/3 of the water with what was reported to be the world's longest siphon. Mule-powered pumps on the other end removed the other 1/3 of water.
In addition to the 4 tunnels, there were several very large cuts needed to keep the grade level of the railroad acceptable. Robertson's Hollow was 2 miles down to the east of the Brooksville Tunnel and 80 feet deep. Another cut was at Dove Spring Hollow, and then there was Kelly's Cut below the Greenwood Tunnel. This work was extremely difficult in a time without earth-moving equipment and diesel trucks. The Tredegar Iron Works produced rails and bridge materials, including the bridge over the river in Waynesboro, which was prefabricated and sent to the site via the temporary tracks over the mountains. The principal owner of the Tredegar was Joseph Reed Anderson. His company rolled iron for the Confederate ship CSS Virginia, the first ironclad ship. During the Civil War, the Iron Works would produce 90% of the artillery ammunition and over 1,000 mortars and artillery guns for the South, which included guns on Confederate ships. The Tredegar Works also produced ammunition for the U.S. Navy and Army from that time through the Korean War. The coal used in the ironworks processes came from the Midlothian mines. Crozet's daughter, Claudia, married the mine owner's son, Dr. Charles Mills. His father was considered one of the wealthiest men in Virginia. The James River and Kanawha Canal flowed in front of the Tredegar Works. The locks here were raised and lowered to allow boats to pass. The canal flows toward the locks with Tredegar in the background. The railroad bridge over the James River has been used since 1857. Secretary of War Floyd appointed Crozet the principal assistant superintendent of the Washington Aqueduct, December 1st, 1857. This project would bring water from the Great Falls of the Potomac River into the city. In July 1859, there was a shortage of funds and the project was halted. Crozet lived with his wife Agatha, daughter Claudia, and Dr. Mills from July 1859 to July 1860. He did work on a part of a congressional report on the academic program for West Point. In July 1860, he took over as chief engineer for the Virginia and Tennessee Railroad. On March 14, 1861, Crozet's wife, Agatha, died at the age of 78. She was buried in the Shockoe Hill Cemetery beside Adelaide and Alfred. On the heels of this tragedy, the Civil War began. Because of the shortages of materials caused by the war, the position as chief engineer was effectively terminated July 1861. The destruction of so much of his work by acts of war must have dismayed Crozet. Many bridges, roads, and railroads were destroyed. The reason railroads were destroyed was because of their ability to move men and material efficiently. The railroads brought warfare into the modern era. During the Civil War, Stonewall Jackson confiscated a number of locomotives. In the spring of 1862, old number 199, a camelback, was hauled by horses over the highway from Martinsburg, West Virginia, then through Harrisonburg, Virginia, to Stanton on the Valley Pike, today's Route 11. After the war, this locomotive was operated on the same route by rail it had previously traveled by highway. It was used by the Chesapeake Western Railroad and was destroyed in a wreck in 1892. In 1861, Crozet was 71 years old.
As an old soldier, I know the value of discipline, without which no service can be effectively rendered.
Major John Tyler, a son of the former president, suggested Crozet call on Confederate President Jefferson Davis to find some position he could perform for his adopted home, Virginia. President Davis was an 1828 graduate of West Point and had been trained by Crozet's methods. Colonel Francis Smith was called from his VMI duties to Richmond. Virginia's Adjutant General Richardson considered asking Crozet to be acting superintendent of VMI, but Crozet's age apparently made him ineligible. Claudius Crozet died January 29, 1864. The newspaper marked his passing. Died January 29, 1864, at Midlothian, the residence of his son-in-law, Dr. C.S. Mills, near the city of Richmond. Colonel Crozet in the 75th year of his age. The New York, Philadelphia, New Orleans, and Paris papers are requested to copy. He was laid to rest with his family in Shockoe Hill Cemetery in Richmond in Range 9, Section 10, Quarter Section 4. The grave was unmarked except for a small stone for his daughter, Adelaide. As years passed, the inscription on that faded. Within 4 months after Crozet's death, the VMI cadets would be called into battle by General Robert E. Lee at New Market, Virginia. We look at the Battle of New Market because of Crozet's involvement in the founding of VMI and to honor the cadets who fought and died that day. General Robert E. Lee ordered Major General John Cabell Breckinridge to confront a federal army under Major General Franz Sigel. Breckinridge had been the youngest vice president of the United States, serving under James Buchanan. Sigel was marching south in the Shenandoah Valley toward Stanton. His troop morale was low. The men were weary from long marches, heat, and dust. They experienced constant harassment from Mosby's raiders. General Sigel's forces numbered 8,940 men. At Woodstock, Sigel intercepted dispatches to Breckinridge. He knew a battle was imminent. General Lee and VMI Superintendent Francis Smith had discussed the use of the cadets. Governor Letcher had made the cadets available for emergencies as early as 1863. In May 1861, cadets were called to Richmond with then Major Thomas Jackson to be drill masters to prepare new Confederate recruits for the field. Superintendent Smith ordered Commandant Scott Shipp, 24 years old and fourth in his class of 1859, to have the cadets ready to march May 11th at 7 a.m. 27 unhappy cadets would have to stay to guard the Institute. The Corps marched 18 miles the first day. On May 12th, in the rain and mud, they marched to just outside Stanton. It had rained for days and was extremely hot. On May 13th, they moved up the Valley Pike, now Highway 11, to Lacey Spring. The cadets carried Austrian muzzle loaders with 40 rounds of ammunition each. The artillery section had 2 3-inch iron rifles. There were 2 drummers and a fifer and 7 field officers. New Market, a little town of 700, would earn a place in history on May 15, 1864. At 1:30 a.m., VMI Professor of Tactics, Frank Preston, offered prayer for the protection of the Corps, and they marched out of Lacey Springs. It was exactly a year since the cadets had participated in the funeral for Stonewall Jackson, the former VMI professor and hero of the Shenandoah Valley campaign. It was the first time an entire school body would turn out for a military engagement. 229 cadets would be engaged. They were eager to fight. The veterans teased the young men when they arrived, but were impressed with their discipline, precision, order, and uniforms. Their average age was 18. Breckinridge greeted them and said,
"Young gentlemen, I hope there will be no occasion to use you, but if there is, I trust you will do your duty."
Breckinridge's officers included Colonel George S. Patton from the VMI class of 1852. Patton had 6 brothers in the Confederate Army, including Cadet Sergeant William in Company B. Colonel Patton would become a grandfather of World War II commander of the 3rd Army, who studied at VMI then graduated from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. Shortly after 11 a.m., Breckinridge sent his troops forward. The battle raged until early afternoon when a gap opened in the Confederate line. Breckinridge held the cadets in reserve. He hesitated to use the cadets to fill the gap, but the dreaded decision had to be made.
Put the boys in, and may God forgive me for the order.
Staff members saw tears in his eyes. He would regret the decision for the rest of his life. With the addition of the cadets, the now unbroken Confederate line eventually advanced on the Union positions. With the culmination of the Confederate advance, the Union lines were broken. Not only was the Union Army in retreat, the VMI Corps of Cadets had earned a place in history. To quote William C. Davis, famous Civil War author, from his book, The Battle of Newmarket, published by Doubleday, "They fought like men. They held a critical post in a wavering line and stood their ground, to be in the forefront in the final charge. They did not win the battle, but it could not have been won as it was without them. Even their enemies were impressed. Lieutenant Colonel Lincoln of the 34th Massachusetts said he had never seen discipline until he watched those boys advance." The Union retreat continued until dusk. As Sigel rushed towards the Shenandoah River Bridge, Captain Henry DuPont, with his Battery B, 5th Artillery, staggered his guns on the pike and covered the retreat. After the Federals had made it across the bridge, the battle was over. People miles away could hear the cheering of the Confederates. Captain DuPont was the last to cross the bridge, and he promptly burned it. The Shenandoah River being at flood stage due to the constant rains prevented any Confederate action during this part of the retreat. A soldier in Sigel's army would write, "I have been present at all the battles in the Valley of Virginia, but this was the hardest fought battle I have yet witnessed." Cadets Duck Colonna and Moses Ezekiel went back to the battlefield looking for their friend Tom Jefferson and found him with a severe wound in the chest. Ezekiel walked to town barefooted to get a wagon to move him. At the home of Liddy Kleindienst, a room was provided. On the evening of May 17th, Jefferson asked his friend Ezekiel, a Jew, to read from the New Testament.
"Let not your heart be troubled. Ye believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you." And
Ezekiel realized Tom was finished. The Kleindienst family gathered, holding lighted tapers, as Ezekiel held his friend in his arms, and then he died. 10 cadets died and 47 were wounded. After Newmarket, General David Hunter replaced Sigel and continued the Valley Campaign. In an attempt to sever Lee's communications from Lynchburg, Hunter detoured to pay a visit to the Virginia Military Institute. General Hunter was from a prominent Virginia family and an 1822 graduate of West Point. He was 62. Hunter studied under Crozet. Hunter occupied the superintendent's quarters and set about destroying the institute. Several of his officers tried in vain to get him to spare VMI, including future U.S. Presidents Rutherford B. Hayes and William McKinley. Captain Henry DuPont, the artillery officer who helped in the Federal retreat at Newmarket, also tried to prevent this destruction. DuPont would later receive the Medal of Honor. He had applied to VMI years before, but at the time VMI only allowed Virginians. He was a West Point graduate. DuPont, as a U.S. Senator in 1913, sponsored legislation to reimburse VMI for the destruction caused by General Hunter. The statue of George Washington, which stands at Washington Arch, was a trophy of war and was taken to West Virginia. It was returned years later. The Cadet Corps fled to Richmond and stayed in the almshouse, which, ironically, was across the street from Crozet's gravesite at Chaco Hills Cemetery. VMI was represented in the Civil War armies until the war ended in 1865.
General William C. Wickham, who was president of Virginia Central Railroad in 1866, and then president of the C&O Railroad in 1869, in naming a new depot between Meacham's River and Blair Park, said flatly, "It will be Crozet or nothing." He wished to recognize Crozet for his work on the Blue Ridge Railroad and Tunnel. Wickham had been a Confederate general and remembered Crozet was loyal to Virginia when the war came.
As far as I know, most of Crozet was built on the Whalen property.
I believe you're right. I believe that's true.
And it ran, I know that it ran down, what I call down the track toward Charlottesville, and way up into the mountains, going up to Greenwood way. I've seen Crozet grow from when it used to be, it used to have a depot on the opposite side of the tracks. And the Crozet depot on one side and the freight depot on the other side. See, my father's home place was right down there in the village. It ran almost over to the depot. And my daddy was in the railroad business for years and years. Grandparents worked for the railroad. I think, I'm not sure, but I think Papa was a station agent there at Crozet. I was on the young side at that time. But we all worked, everybody helped everybody to do things. If somebody needed help, you could go across the streets and ask any of your neighbors if you could come over and give us a hand on saying things. And everybody was ready to work, and you got all of 10 cents an hour. All of them.
And don't spend it all in one place.
No, don't spend it all in one place.
On Wednesday, November 11th, 1942, Armistice Day, Colonel Claudius Crozet's remains were reburied at the Virginia Military Institute in Lexington, Virginia. It was the 103rd anniversary of Founders Day. Addresses were given by J.W. Johns, a member of the Board of Visitors, and Colonel William Cooper, who in 1936 had published the first biography of Crozet.
On November the 11th, 1942, the remains of Colonel Claudius Crozet were reinterred at this spot in front of the Preston Library at the Virginia Military Institute. The Corps cadets numbered approximately 700 young men, and all of them were on the parade ground in their winter dress uniforms for the event. It had long been the hope of Colonel William Cooper, the late historiographer of VMI, to have Colonel Crozet's remains reinterred at the Institute. The body of Colonel Crozet lay in state in Preston Library, which is just behind me, overnight preceding his reinterment. Cadet guards were placed around his bier and remained so for a 24-hour period. On the morning of November the 11th, Colonel Cooper, the master of ceremonies, led the procession from Preston Library to this spot, and he was followed by the superintendent, the superintendent's party, members of the Board of Visitors, and members of the faculty and staff. As a cadet, in the Corps of Cadets, we were all standing on the parade ground at attention or at present arms throughout the ceremony. I don't remember exactly what the weather was like, but it was a bright, clear day, and I do remember that it appeared that we were in formation for an interminably long time. I did not recognize or realize at the time the great impact that Colonel Crozet had on VMI. Although VMI is in a rural area, and this country was under war conditions in November 1942, a large crowd had gathered and observed the reinterment ceremonies.
Mr. Allen Sandrich, with the title of Tunnel Master, would walk through the old Blue Ridge Tunnel to check for fallen rocks and other problems prior to scheduled trains. His family lived close by. He was there from 1938 to 1944 and also served as a brakeman and a section foreman for the C&O Railway. Another man, Tet Baber, also was a watchman for the Blue Ridge Tunnel. Earlier, a man named David Sheeler was a watchman for 22 years. This is the building used for shelter at the tunnel. During World War II, it became apparent a larger tunnel was needed to handle the giant engines and cars the C&O Railroad was using for the war effort. The new Blue Ridge Tunnel was built with a concrete floor, and the wall and ceiling were encased in concrete. Construction began in 1942 and was finished in 1944. This picture by the late William E. Warden, Jr., courtesy of the Waynesboro News-Virginian, shows the location of the new tunnel compared to the old. Train passengers are treated to this view of the beautiful Rockfish Valley as they head east toward Charlottesville.
Well, I first went to work in 1927 in West Virginia. And I've worked to C&O from Hinton, West Virginia to Charlottesville over the years. And after 45 years, then I retired. Worked in this old Blue Ridge Tunnel here and helped cut the track in and put the first train through the new tunnel. That was in April 12, 1944. And I worked in the old tunnel about 6 weeks one time, about 1935. Had a general maintenance work. When we cut the new tunnel in here, the track curved on around over to the right, in behind that building, and the next building, then came back. That's when they cut the track in for the 1944 for the service. The degree curve continues all the way through, but the new tunnel comes straight. So you get almost this end, and the curve is sudden then. Put all the curve right in this end. The old tunnel had a continuous curve all the way through, and the other end was much higher than this end. The top of the hill is, the mountain is actually about a quarter mile other side of the old tunnel. And it starts downgrade then. The old tunnel built right on the earth with ballast rock under it. The new tunnel has got a solid cement floor in it all the way through, and the ties are not clear across. They're only 29 inches long and set down in the cement. And the rail is spiked to the ties then. And they don't go clear across like a regular cross tie.
Well, obviously, Crozet had a great influence on Virginia's transportation system, both during his lifetime and after his death. Many, if not most, of the major highways and railroads that we today travel in Virginia and West Virginia were laid out, surveyed by Crozet or by people working under his direction. In addition to that, Crozet brought early on an attitude of technical competence and innovation that I think continues. But probably as much as these two things was what he left us through the Virginia Military Institute, which has always had a very close working relationship with what's now the Virginia Department of Transportation. Currently, the chief engineer the commissioner, several of the district engineers are graduates of VMI, and that's been true throughout the history. So he left us not only a good transportation system, or the beginnings of a good transportation system, but also a legacy that continues on to the present time.
Perhaps the most enduring accomplishment of Crozet's career was his role as a founder of the Virginia Military Institute. VMI is America's first state-supported military college. Since its founding in 1839, the Virginia Military Institute has maintained a nationally acclaimed quality in higher education, producing leaders for all walks of life. A 4-year undergraduate college, VMI combines the studies of a full college curriculum and a daily regimen of military training and discipline, with emphasis on quality, honor, integrity, and responsibility. Its 1,200 cadets pursue BA or BS degrees in 13 disciplines in the general fields of engineering, science, and liberal arts. Intercollegiate athletics is an integral part of the VMI system. The Institute sponsors 13 sports on the NCAA Division I level. Leadership training is not a 1-hour course at VMI. It occurs 24 hours a day in all aspects of cadet life. To impress the importance of leadership on cadets, numerous nationally and internationally recognized leaders have spoken at VMI. The Corps of Cadets are often called upon to participate in formal functions. In recent years, VMI and Crozet's alma mater, the École Polytechnique, located near Paris, France, have established a closer relationship. Internships for cadets are available during summer sessions. Sports competition is scheduled between the two schools. Faculty, officers, students, and dignitaries regularly exchange visits.
Je suis le superintendant de l'école polytechnique à Paris et je suis venu pour les célébrations de la bataille de Newmarket. Cela montre que l'école polytechnique et VMI ont de très bonnes relations et nous apprécions le système de formation donné ici aux cadets de VMI. Je suis venu ici invité par le général Bunting et nous avons l'intention de développer les échanges entre nos deux écoles.
VMI, at the end of the 20th century, owes much to Colonel Claudius Crozet. The engineering departments, the engineering faculty, the building that is behind me, the science building, the latest building to be constructed here at VMI, which houses biology and chemistry, all trace their origin to the scientific education that Colonel Claudius Crozet brought with him to West Point and then to VMI. The emphasis that the École Polytechnique placed on practical education, scientific education, and education to help build a nation, these are what Colonel Claudius Crozet brought with him to this nation.
The VMI Post, rich in American history, is a National Historic District, and the Cadet Barracks a National Historic Landmark. Crozet Hall, named after Colonel Claudius Crozet, is the dining facility for the cadets.
Crozet Hall is probably most mess hall here. You can see the entire Corps. And it was named for Colonel Claudius Crozet. He was a French soldier, engineer, and educator. And he was the one that first used VMI, the initials VMI, to call the Institute that.
The VMI Museum, located in Jackson Memorial Hall, chronicles the history of the Institute. The Marshall Museum, located across the parade ground from the barracks, depicts the life and career of five-star General of the Army, George C. Marshall. General Marshall was a 1901 VMI graduate and the only soldier to win the Nobel Peace Prize. Perhaps the greatest testament to the efficacy of the VMI system can be found in the performance of the Corps of Cadets during the Civil War. On May 15, 1864, at the Battle of Newmarket, the Corps of Cadets became the only college student body in the nation ever to have fought in a pitched battle. As a monument to the Corps of Cadets and to the Civil War soldiers who fought there, VMI operates the Hall of Valor Museum on the site of that famous battle.
Claudius Crozet had died just 4 short months before the cadets would be immortalized in the May 15th Battle of Newmarket in 1864. But no doubt he would have felt their duty and service to the Commonwealth, the fulfillment of his vision for the Virginia Military Institute as he had guided it through its early years. Every year since that date, in 1864, the cadets will gather at VMI and commemorate that event by forming up on the parade ground and calling out the names of the 10 cadets who died as a result of their service in that rainy Sunday afternoon battle of May the 15th. As the names are called, they're echoed across the parade ground, and the statue, Virginia Mourning Her Dead, looks down upon them. The work of one of the cadets that actually fought in the battle, Sir Moses Ezekiel, who became an international artist later in his life. 6 of the 10 cadets who were killed in the battle are today buried below Virginia Mourning Her Dead as she looks out across the parade ground.
Corporal Atwell, Private Haynes, Private Jefferson, Private McDowell, Private Standard, Private Wheelwright, Sergeant Cabell, Private Crockett, Private Hartsfield, Private Jones, died on the field of honor, sir. Here, wait! Up!
There are very few monuments here at VMI to Colonel Crozet, but VMI as a whole, its educational program, its emphasis on public service,
and above all, its emphasis on science and technology all stand as a monument to this great man, Colonel Claudius Crozet.
In 1989, a new biography of Claudius Crozet was co-authored by Colonel Edwin L. Dooley and VMI Professor of History Emeritus Robert F. Hunter.
I was a graduate student at Professor John Kraut's seminar at Columbia University in 1947, looking for a dissertation topic in Virginia history of the antebellum period, about which surprisingly little had been written. I talked with Dr. William Van Schreven, head of documents at the Virginia State Library, who said, "We have a mass of legislative petitions and also records of turnpike companies that have hardly been used. Why not consider a history of the toll road movement in Virginia?" That did become my dissertation topic, and in the research I encountered Claudius Crozet at every turn. I was so impressed with that man's character, ability, intelligence, and industry that I wanted to know more about him. In 1954, I joined the history faculty at VMI, the school Crozet helped establish in 1839. In the early 1970s, I had the good fortune to share an office with Ed Dooley, and we agreed to combine efforts at the earliest opportunity and write a new biography and update the solid work of William Cooper, written in the 1930s. The resulting book was published in 1989 in time for the sesquicentennial celebration of the founding of VMI. Ed Dooley did the research in France, particularly at the École Polytechnique, where Crozet was an early graduate, and also wrote of his role in founding VMI. I dealt with his engineering work in Virginia, which then included West Virginia, and Louisiana. First and foremost, Crozet loved Virginia as his adopted home and left an enduring legacy. Crozet may have been a minor figure in the broad sweep of American history, but the example he set is one that others may well emulate.
John Daniel Imboden was a native of Augusta County and practiced law in Stanton in the 1840s and 50s. He organized the Stanton Artillery and served as a Confederate general during the Civil War. Imboden was a friend of Crozet's from before the war. In 1886, he wrote this sketch about Crozet.
He was irritable in business matters and intolerant of pretenders of all sorts, and especially of quacks in his own profession. He was not a popular man. He was a thorough Republican, neither birth nor rank weighed a feather in his scales. He was scrupulously honest, despising kings, hating imperialism, detesting Napoleon, whom he regarded as finally a traitor to his country and to mankind, though he admired his genius. Abhorring war and loving liberty and peace, he entered more thoroughly and understandingly into the political and social life of Virginia than foreigners are wont to do. And had he been a native born, he would have been distinguished in the true sense as a man of the people, an upholder of the laws which restrain their passions and protect their rights.
Many giants in Virginia history, such as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Robert E. Lee, overshadow the lesser heroes, regardless of their contributions. Perhaps had Crozet been an American, he would have had more publicity for the great works he produced. We have gone to great lengths to find as much as possible about this unique man. This documentary will serve to inform more people about the outstanding contributions this man provided Virginia and the rest of America. And thank you for watching the program with us.